The grand ballroom was deafeningly loud, filled with the sharp clinking of crystal glasses and ripples of collective laughter. On the massive digital screen behind the head table, a towering photograph of me filled the room. I stood frozen in the center of the floor as the next slide flickered into view, displaying bold, mocking letters across my face. The permanent disappointment. Beneath it, a bulleted list cataloged my life's apparent failures for 200 high society guests to see. Unfinished education, a broken marriage, and a bankrupt future. My mother raised her wine glass toward the crowd, a tight, artificial smile fixed on her lips, while my father slowly shook his head, leaning into his microphone to ensure everyone heard his next words. He remarked that perhaps tonight, under the weight of her sister's spectacular success, she would finally learn what true humility looks like. My younger sister, glowing in her custom designer gown, leaned over the podium and smirked into her lapel mic, whispering that I shouldn't take it personally because they were simply highlighting reality. I felt hundreds of judgmental, pitying eyes boring into my skin, and my fingers began to shake against the fabric of my dress. But then a sudden, heavy vibration buzzed in the palm of my hand. I lowered my gaze, read the single line of text on my screen, and in an instant the suffocating weight in the room completely vanished. My name is Clara Vance, and at 34 years old, I had long since accepted my role as the designated black sheep of the family. From the moment we were children, my younger sister, Evelyn, was the undisputed golden child. She was a walking trophy for my parents, accumulating flawless academic records, prestigious awards, and a curated circle of influential friends. Every minor achievement of hers was treated as a historic milestone, celebrated with lavish parties and breathless boasts to our extended relatives. When Evelyn gained admission to an elite Ivy League institution, my parents funded a massive celebration that lasted an entire weekend. When I chose a local state college to pursue an unconventional path in systems logistics and technology, my father openly questioned why I lacked the drive to match my sister's brilliance. Years later, when my young marriage dissolved under the weight of irreconcilable differences, my family didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. Instead, they weaponized the divorce as definitive proof that I was fundamentally incapable of sustaining a successful life. They never understood that walking away from a toxic, manipulative relationship wasn't an act of failure. It was an act of survival. Around that same painful period in my life, I made the quiet decision to withdraw from standard university courses entirely. I chose to invest every remaining penny of my meager savings into a highly speculative, classified tech startup focused on secure government logistics and defense data architecture. When my parents discovered my decision, they didn't hide their amusement. My father told the neighbors I was chasing fairy tales, while Evelyn openly laughed during family dinners, calling my tiny operation a pathetic hobby. Whenever distant aunts and uncles visited, the conversation would inevitably drift toward my string of disastrous life choices. I became the cautionary tale, the living example of what happens when a child rejects the family's rigid expectations. So when Evelyn sent out the invitations for her multi-million-dollar high society wedding gala, my initial instinct was to decline. But a small, stubborn part of me still held onto a fragile hope. I foolishly imagined that perhaps just for one evening, the competitive malice would be set aside, and we could pretend to be a normal, supportive family. The venue they chose was breathtakingly opulent, a historic estate adorned with cascading white orchids and towering crystal chandeliers. Everything was perfectly orchestrated, polished to a brilliant, blinding sheen. Yet during the early hours of the reception, a familiar, unsettling pattern began to emerge. I caught Evelyn whispering intensely with the event coordinator near the main AV booth, her eyes repeatedly darting across the crowded room to lock onto me. Each time our eyes met, a sharp, knowing smirk crossed her face, the exact expression she wore whenever she had successfully set a trap for me during our childhood. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I tried desperately to dismiss the feeling, telling myself that I was being overly defensive, but deep down in my gut, I knew a storm was gathering. I just had no conception of exactly how cruel they were willing to be. Within the hour, every elite guest, political figure and corporate executive in that ballroom would bear witness to the absolute contempt my family held for me. The formal ceremony itself had gone off without a single hitch. Evelyn had glided down the aisle with the practiced perfection of a silver screen actress, prompting soft tears from the front rows as cinematic music swelled through the hidden speakers. For a few brief hours, the sheer beauty of the event made me lower my guard, and I actually started to believe that my dark apprehensions were nothing more than lingering paranoia. Then the reception dinner drew to a close. Evelyn stood up, tapped the side of her champagne glass with a silver spoon, and confidently stepped onto the elevated stage. She announced through the microphone that before the dancing commenced, she had prepared a special surprise retrospective of the family's journey. The crowd applauded warmly as the ambient lights dimmed, and the massive projector screen behind her crackled to life. The presentation began innocently enough, displaying standard childhood photographs, sunlit family vacations and joyous holiday gatherings. The guests chuckled and smiled as decades of curated memories flashed by in high definition. But then the tone shifted abruptly. A candid, unflattering photograph of me from my early, struggling 20s filled the screen. The slide transition revealed a heavy title, The Dropout Phase. A few muffled chuckles rippled through the back tables, and I felt my entire body go completely rigid. Another slide immediately replaced it, featuring a picture of me sitting among packed moving boxes after my divorce, captioned, "The Family Expert in Disastrous Partnerships." The laughter in the room grew louder, no longer disguised. My heart dropped heavily into my chest. I instinctively looked toward my parents' table, expecting to see shock or disapproval on their faces. Instead, my mother was elegantly sipping her drink, a look of serene satisfaction on her face, while my father gave a slow, affirming nod. The public execution continued systematically. Slide after slide exposed the most vulnerable private chapters of my life, stripped of context and reduced to mocking punchlines. The divorce champion. The professional dream chaser. Still searching for a purpose at 34. The atmosphere in the ballroom turned thick with uncomfortable amusement. Some older guests looked visibly embarrassed, shifting in their seats, while others turned around to stare directly at me with heavy, suffocating pity. Evelyn gripped the microphone tighter, letting out a bright, melodic laugh as she addressed the crowd, asking everyone to relax because if a family couldn't engage in a little harmless ribbing, who could? My father raised his glass high in agreement, declaring loudly that perhaps this public reminder would finally instill a sense of reality into his eldest daughter. The skin on my face burned with an intense, agonizing heat. Decades of unprovoked insults, a lifetime of being weighed against a golden standard and found wanting, and years of being treated like an invisible mistake had all culminated in this single meticulously planned moment of public degradation. I wanted to push my chair back, sprint through the exit and vanish into the night. But as I gripped the edge of the table, an overwhelming sense of calm suddenly washed over the anger. A deep internal voice told me to stay exactly where I was, because the narrative of this night was far from finished. It was precisely at that second that my phone delivered a sharp rhythmic vibration against my palm. I looked down at the illuminated screen, seeing a message from a private, encrypted contact number I hadn't seen in months. My eyes widened as I processed the message. It contained only 8 words. "We are at the perimeter. Awaiting your signal." In an instant, the ambient noise of the snickering crowd and the blaring music seemed to completely dissolve into absolute silence. I read the text a second time, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs, not out of fear, but from the sudden electrifying realization of what was about to happen. 6 years ago, while my family was busy broadcasting my failures to anyone who would listen, I had quietly co-founded a specialized, highly secure infrastructure and logistics software firm alongside 2 brilliant defense engineers. The early days were brutal, devoid of any luxury or comfort. There were long, agonizing months where I slept on a cot in a windowless office, barely generating enough capital to cover basic server costs, while well-meaning acquaintances urged me to abandon the hopeless project. My parents had officially written it off as an embarrassing, prolonged tantrum, while Evelyn used it as a frequent punchline during social gatherings. Even as our client portfolio began to expand into substantial territory, not a single member of my family ever bothered to ask how the business was performing. They never asked about our contracts, our team, or our day-to-day operations. They had already constructed a permanent, unchangeable version of who I was in their minds, and they never possessed the humility to check if their assumptions were wrong. Over the intervening years, that fragile, laughed-at startup evolved into an absolute titan within the secure enterprise market, securing massive international logistics contracts and employing hundreds of specialists across 3 different continents. I intentionally chose to keep my accelerating success entirely private, largely because I was far too consumed by the immense responsibilities of the business, but mostly because I had grown profoundly exhausted from begging for validation from people who were deeply invested in my failure. While my family continued to treat me like a fragile charity case barely clinging to the margins of society, I was quietly orchestrating some of the most significant infrastructure architecture in the sector. The sheer irony of the situation would have been comical if the deep-seated emotional wounds hadn't run so incredibly deep. I looked across the dim ballroom toward the illuminated stage. Evelyn was still caught up in a wave of self-congratulatory laughter with her bridesmaids, and my parents were looking around the room, radiant with pride. They honestly believed they had secured a permanent victory, ensuring that my public humiliation would be the defining, memorable highlight of the entire wedding weekend. I slowly opened the messaging application, typed out a single definitive word, "Come," and slipped the phone quietly back into my evening bag. A few tense minutes ticked by. The standard reception programming resumed, the upbeat dance music kicked back in, and guests began to mingle once more. Nobody in the room noticed when the heavy soundproof double doors at the back of the ballroom were quietly but firmly pushed open. Nobody noticed the 3 imposing, immaculately tailored figures who stepped over the threshold and into the light. At least not initially. I recognized every single one of them the moment their silhouettes cut through the doorway. The man on the left was our corporation's brilliant chief operating officer. The individual on the right was our primary institutional venture partner. And the man leading them down the center aisle was an internationally renowned corporate restructuring attorney and private equity billionaire whose face had graced the covers of every major global financial publication for the last decade. As the trio marched with absolute military precision toward the main stage, the lively conversations at the perimeter tables began to stutter and die out. One by one, heads began to turn. A heavy wave of confused whispers rippled across the room, cascading from table to table like wildfire. For the very first time that evening, the supreme confidence on my sister's face faltered, replaced by a sudden flicker of intense nervousness. The entire ballroom grew progressively quieter with every single step the 3 men took. The ambient chatter ceased entirely. Silverware remained frozen halfway to people's mouths, and even the DJ, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, slowly dialed the background music down until it faded into nothingness. Evelyn watched the uninvited guests approach the stage with a look of profound, visible bewilderment, whispering frantically to her new husband, asking what was happening. The senior executive reached the steps of the stage first. With an aura of absolute authority that commanded the attention of everyone in the room, he politely but firmly bypassed the event coordinator, stepped up to the podium and took hold of the primary microphone. The silence in the room became absolute, so quiet that you could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning. He cleared his throat, his deep, resonant voice echoing flawlessly through the high-end sound system. He apologized to the gathering for the unexpected interruption of the festivities, introducing himself as Lawrence Vance Montgomery. A sharp, collective gasp echoed from the tables near the front, where several prominent local business owners instantly recognized the name of one of the most powerful private equity forces in the country. He offered a calm, measured smile to the stunned audience, explaining that he had not originally intended to disrupt this beautiful wedding reception. However, he noted he and his senior partners happened to be executing a major corporate closing in the immediate area, and they had suddenly realized that the single most vital individual to the future of their global enterprise was sitting in this very room tonight. A wave of intense, confused murmuring swept through the crowd as guests looked wildly at one another, trying to identify the secret titan among them. Lawrence slowly turned his body away from the podium, his sharp, discerning gaze scanning the crowd until his eyes locked directly onto my table. He spoke clearly into the microphone, asking if Clara Vance would please stand up. Every single head in the grand ballroom snapped around in perfect unison, their eyes landing squarely on my chair. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back and stood up to my full height, smoothing down the fabric of my dress. The triumphant, mocking smirk that had lived on my sister's face all evening vanished instantly, leaving her pale and completely breathless. My parents sat frozen, their features twisted into a look of total, uncomprehending shock. Lawrence continued speaking, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of profound respect. He informed the room that 6 years ago, Clara had quietly co-founded a pioneering secure logistics and data architecture firm. He reminded the audience that while 95% of such ambitious startups collapse under their own weight within the first 2 years, this specific entity had done something entirely different. With a brief nod from Lawrence to the tech booth, the giant projector screen behind him instantly overrode Evelyn's mocking slideshow. The humiliating pictures were instantly replaced by a massive, sleek corporate logo, followed immediately by certified financial audits, explosive annual revenue graphs, international office listings and high-level federal partnership certifications. The entire assembly of high society guests stared at the data in a state of paralyzed, breathless silence. Lawrence's voice cut through the stillness like a knife, announcing that their private equity consortium had just finalized a definitive strategic acquisition and merger agreement with Clara's firm, valuing the transaction at just over $55 million. A loud, uncontrolled chorus of gasps and shocked exclamations erupted from every corner of the ballroom. Lawrence maintained his steady smile, adding that as the primary visionary and majority founder, Clara remained the single largest individual stakeholder in the newly unified global entity. I looked over at my father, whose mouth had literally dropped open in absolute disbelief, his face draining of all color. My mother looked as though she had completely forgotten the mechanics of how to breathe, her hands trembling violently against the edge of the table. But Lawrence wasn't quite finished speaking. He looked around the silent room, stating that what was truly remarkable was that Clara had engineered this entire international empire completely in reverse, building it from nothing while enduring years of relentless skepticism, profound isolation, and unyielding criticism from those who should have believed in her most. He concluded by saying that having worked alongside hundreds of global founders throughout his career, he had met very few individuals who possessed even a fraction of Clara's fierce resilience and unbreakable dignity. The ensuing silence in the massive room became so heavy it felt almost physical. But then from a table near the back, a single guest began to clap. A second person joined in, then a third, and within a matter of seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. The very same people who had been comfortably laughing at my calculated public humiliation just 20 minutes earlier were now standing on their feet, clapping frantically, their eyes filled with a completely transformed look of profound reverence and awe. Standing directly in the center of the storm, Evelyn looked as though the earth itself had collapsed beneath her feet, her perfect bridal moment completely shattered by the weight of her own malice. The applause seemed to stretch on for an eternity, washing over me in waves. I stood there completely grounded, watching the sea of shifting faces. Yet the most telling reactions didn't belong to the wealthy guests or the prominent community leaders. They belonged exclusively to my family. My father was the first to break away from his table, slowly navigating the crowded floor toward me. For the first time in my entire existence, the supreme arrogant confidence had completely drained from his demeanor, leaving him looking remarkably small and utterly devoid of answers. He looked up at me, his voice a hollow, quiet whisper as he asked why I had never told them what I was doing. I looked down at him for a long, quiet moment, allowing the silence to stretch between us before I offered a small, tinged smile, replying simply that they had never once bothered to ask. He instantly lowered his eyes, unable to sustain the eye contact. A moment later, my mother appeared at his side, heavy tears welling in her eyes as she reached out a trembling hand toward my arm. She whispered softly that they had been terribly wrong about me. For over a decade, I had spent countless sleepless nights desperately imagining what it would feel like to finally hear those exact words fall from her lips. I had thought it would bring a surge of intense triumph or a burning sense of vindication. But standing there in reality, looking at the two people who had shaped my deepest insecurities, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, beautiful stillness. I wasn't angry, I wasn't looking to humiliate them in return, and I felt no need for vengeance. I was simply entirely finished. Finally, Evelyn approached, the remnants of her perfect, heavily curated wedding day crumbling around her. The artificial, rehearsed smile was entirely gone from her face. She looked at me, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation as she whispered that this wasn't supposed to happen tonight. I nearly laughed out loud, not out of cruelty but because it was the single most authentic, transparent statement she had ever made in my presence. For the first time in our entire lives, she wasn't hiding behind a mask of performative sisterly love. I looked her in the eyes and agreed that no, it certainly wasn't supposed to go this way. She immediately launched into a frantic, breathless defense, claiming that the slideshow was merely intended as a light-hearted joke, that nobody could have possibly anticipated things would escalate to this level, and that she had never truly intended to cause me any real pain. But I had already spent a lifetime listening to their empty justifications, and I had absolutely no desire to hear any more. I didn't engage in an argument, I didn't use my newfound leverage to embarrass her further on her big day, and I didn't offer a single parting insult. I simply reached down, picked up my evening bag from the table and prepared to exit the room. As my fingers touched the heavy brass handles of the ballroom doors, I paused for a single final beat, turning my head back to look at the family that had defined my worth by my failures for 34 years. I stated quietly that true success isn't about spending your life proving your doubters wrong. It is about finally reaching the place where you no longer require their approval to exist. Then I turned my back on the room and walked out into the cool, quiet night. A year has passed since that evening and my business continues to expand into global markets, reaching heights I never could have imagined during those lonely nights on an office cot. My life has settled into a deep, unshakable peace. For the first time in my existence, I have completely stopped trying to negotiate for a seat at a table where I was never truly seen or valued. Because the exact moment I chose to stop chasing their validation was the exact moment I finally discovered my own worth.